Thanks very much, Simeon, and good afternoon. I find myself in a, well, hold on a minute, let me see if I can get some presentation stuff here. Ah, yes. Good. I find myself in a bit of a difficult situation because normally speaking, I would be standing up here talking to you about reasonably technical matters. But as we've seen this morning, we've had some rather good news on the technical front. Mojaloop can now support payments that pass between schemes. Schemes can be connected, you didn't see that this morning, but it's true, in arrangements of arbitrary complexity. So we don't insist that we should have a hub and spoke model for connections between schemes. We support schemes connected in series with each other, or indeed combinations of those topologies. And those schemes are connected by proxies. I don't know whether the person is still in the audience who asked the question. Ah, yes, question about proxies this morning. Now, if you had asked me that question, what do proxies do? Thank you very much. I would have answered, actually, the point is they don't do anything. The idea of a proxy is it just routes messages through. But as far as the organization of the scheme goes, it represents the outside to a scheme. So anything that arrives, any message that arrives in a scheme through a proxy, the switch knows that it comes from some other scheme. It doesn't know which one and doesn't need to know which one, but it knows it comes from somewhere else. So we've tried as hard as we possibly can to keep proxies as simple as we possibly can. And for the moment, at least, I think we've succeeded in that. Also, we can manage currency conversion. When we first started thinking about how currency conversion and inter-scheme connectivity should work, we rather expected that currency conversion and connection between schemes would be done by the same thing. And that, for instance, is the assumption that the BIS Nexus project has made. What we've subsequently done is decoupled those two functions from each other. So, for instance, it would be perfectly possible for 2 or 3 or 15 schemes in the same jurisdiction to be connected to each other without any currency conversion at all. Equally, it's possible for a single scheme to span multiple jurisdictions and therefore be able to do currency conversion within a single scheme. So those two are divorced from each other now. And also, currency conversions are interactions for us between DFSPs, not between the accounts. The switch doesn't have any engagement in the currency conversion process, apart from its normal one of routing messages and recording obligations. For us, a currency conversion is a matter between a participant institution, a bank or a mobile money company, and an entity with a special role, a foreign exchange provider, which provides currency conversion services. So we've got that. We also have another bit of good news, I hope. There we are. So we also support the industry standard for financial messaging, ISO 20022. We're going to be talking in more detail about that in the next session, as Simeon said. But one thing that is worth saying is that we are in the process of adding extensions to the existing standard so that it's more well aligned with the way in which inclusive instant payment systems want to operate. So that's full of good news. Everything is fine, and we don't have to worry, at least from a technical perspective, about how all of that is going to work. Now, the question is, do we need to do any more than that? And I want to step back a bit and just look at what happens with cross-border payments today. Now, a recent report says that about 14% of all cross-border payments incur a remediation charge. That's not just payments that fail, but payments where money has to be paid in order to get things right. And the average cost of a remediation for a payment is $12 US, which kind of doesn't sound like much, especially when you average over all the payments, and basically you're saying now cost of remediation per payment is $1.68, which sounds like even less, really, doesn't it? Now, the worry is when you say that, as Julie said in her cross-border session with Jadida and Mike, there's an FSB G20 target cost for remittances by 2027 of 3%, cost of 3%. At that rate, any payment of less than $56 would be unprofitable. And that assumes, of course, that the cost of remediation is the only cost associated with a cross-border payment. So essentially that means that unless we do something about making cross-border payments much more reliable, there isn't really very much chance that the FSB G20 target will be met anytime soon. I want to look particularly now at sub-Saharan Africa. And these are figures taken from the World Bank's Remittance Prices Worldwide survey. Average remittance costs at the moment in sub-Saharan Africa, just under 8%. That compares with a global average of about 1.5% less than that. And where funds are delivered in cash, as very many remittances are, this rises to over 9%. Currently. And our champion corridor, according to the World Bank, is Tanzania to Uganda, which has an average cost of 33%. Now, you can believe that or not. Personally, I find it quite hard to swallow. But it does say this is a real problem. The other worrying thing is that this problem is not a problem which affects remittances from advanced economies. Now, generally speaking, if you're sending from the US, if you're sending from the EU, then you will get a pretty good deal on a transfer. The problem comes with diaspora transfers that are coming, for instance, between African countries or between other emerging economies. And of course, they are the, how can I put this? The corridors which are most recalcitrant to quick fixes. So digitizing payments, I've seen an estimate that said it could save 2.5, sorry, I haven't seen an estimate, it's a simple derivation from that. Digitizing remittance payments could save 2.5% of the cost of an international payment, just like that. That's the difference between 7.9 and 9.03, or thereabouts. Now, what are we trying to do? We're trying to focus, I think, on diaspora personal remittances. We're also focusing on cross-border trade payments and things like that. But for these purposes, I want to think about diaspora personal remittances. We want them immediately to credit payee DFSPs in their home currency to digital accounts. We want it to be the most economical choice for users. And we also, of course, need it to comply with all the relevant requirements. Now, I want to talk about two particular aspects of that. And the first is about interactions between schemes. Now, as I've said, the technical ability to connect between schemes is already there in Mojaloop. But there are problems at a level above the technical that we are going to need to solve in order for us productively to connect schemes with each other. Now, it's been a constant worry of mine that we don't see enough philosophy in these sessions. So I have, of course, those of you who are keen followers of the subject will recognize that the title of this slide is the title of a relatively well-known philosophical book by a philosopher called J.L. Austin. Anyone know what that coat of arms is? No? Okay, London Stock Exchange. The interesting point about that is its motto, dictum pactum meo, which the Latinists among you, which I see probably most of you, will recognize. It means my word is my bond. My word is a reliable promise. So
What Austin wants to say in his excellent little book, which I commend to you, is that some forms of language in some contexts are performative. For instance, I pronounce you man and wife. There are contexts in which messages make things happen. They've got to be the right messages and they've got to be in the right context, but they make something happen. And to use those words properly, by which I mean in the right form, in the right context, means to intend the promise that the words imply and to commit to making good on what it is you're promising. And I want to make the proposition to you that an inclusive instant payment system is a context like that. So I want to talk a little bit about the promises that I think lie behind the messages that Mojaloop systems exchange between their parties. So, what sorts of things is the Mojaloop system trying to solve? An IIPS is simple to implement because the participants all agree to follow the same rules, provided, of course, that the regulatory constraints on those participants are respected. So when you write the rules for an IIPS scheme, or indeed for any kind of scheme, you'll say, this is how the scheme is going to work, and you will make sure that it doesn't work in a way that cuts across the regulatory obligations of some or possibly all of the participants. That's one of the reasons why open loop systems are more difficult than closed loop systems, because if you're dealing with institutions of the same kind as each other, all banks or all mobile money systems, they're all regulated in the same way, and you don't have to worry so much about individual regulatory requirements. Where you've got an open loop system where participants may be regulated in different ways, it's more of a problem. So typically, the regulators of the participants overall and the IIPS are the same as each other. They will be the central bank or the regulatory authorities appointed by the jurisdiction. Now, why can't interswitch communications work in that way? They may be simple in that way, but the regulators of the schemes will probably not be the same. I mean, one of the things that we've heard about in the context of the COMESA system is that one of the things that needs to happen is that the regulators of all of the jurisdictions will need to agree on how payments between those jurisdictions are going to work. And what that means is what sorts of regulations will be applied to payments that originate in one jurisdiction, let's say Rwanda, but are credited to an account in, I don't know, what should we say, Libya. We need to make sure that the regulations covering a payment like that are okay in both contexts. Now, the particular problem here comes when we think about how we're going to connect Mojaloop and non-Mojaloop schemes with each other. Now, one of the bonuses of being able to use a proxy to connect schemes to each other is that there isn't necessarily a requirement that the schemes on both sides of the proxy should be the same as each other. And indeed, we expect in the COMESA system that they won't be the same as each other, that where appropriate jurisdictional payment schemes are in place, that they will be able to connect as a scheme to the COMESA scheme overall. This is a problem that can't be solved at the plumbing level. We need to think about why we do things in a particular way and what other ways of doing the same thing might exist. And in the end, we need a way of deciding whether two schemes are doing the same thing in different ways or whether they're doing different things. If two schemes are doing the same thing in different ways, then that's fine. We just need some way of understanding how things are between them. But if they're doing different things that kind of look like they're the same thing, then we've got a problem, because this is about promises. And if one scheme is interpreting a message as a different kind of promise from the way in which another scheme is interpreting it, then we have a problem. We don't normally think too much about that in the Mojaloop Foundation. We are technically focused quite a lot of the time. But we recognize that we are going to need, with the help of our community, to work through these issues and to arrive at definitions that enable us to make reliable decisions about whether two schemes are doing the same thing as each other, though they may not be doing them in the same way. Now, we've got two guiding principles, really. We intend to be the cheapest instant payment systems for jurisdictions to operate, and we intend to be as reliable as cash. How do we reduce the cost of payments? Well, there are two ways in which we plan to do that. First of all, we want to reduce the incidence of failed payments, and that is payments that need remediation, to approximately zero. Second, we want to reduce the reliance on expensive external transactions like RTGSs, and we do that by bulking up small transfers and using the RTGS to settle them net. So we just make a single, or we make a payment per participant instead of once a day or twice a day or 4 times a day, instead of every time we make a payment. Now, one of the ways in which we do this is the agreement of terms. When we had that conversation about agreement of terms yesterday afternoon, I thought, oh gosh, that's quite interesting, because that's one of the things that I intend to talk about. So what's the agreement of terms? Well, for every Mojaloop payment, it means that the parties to the payment agree on the terms, first of all. They get a chance in advance of trying to execute the payment to say, are you happy with this? If you are happy with it, what is the thing that you're happy with? What are its charges? Who are the parties? All of those kinds of things. The creditor party in our world then puts a cryptographic lock on those terms. And then the payment can only be executed on the terms agreed. Not only that, when the debtor gets a message back to say this payment has been executed by the creditor, it gets that back in a reliable way that it can use to check that that really was issued by the creditor and really was a confirmation of the originally proposed payment. Why do we do this? Well, first of all, we've reversed the normal sequence of clearing and settling. As I said, we settle deferred net, generally speaking, and that means that payments clear, obligations are created before we settle. And it's therefore very important that we don't allow things to proceed forward to settlement until without being confident that they are really going to work. When someone sends money, we also want to ensure that they know everything about the payment before they consent to it. That's a standard thing. And we also want to reduce to zero, as I said, the number of disputes that can arise because there are mistakes in the definition of a payment. The report I referred to earlier on says that approximately 95% of the reasons for remediation of a payment is because there is a problem in definition. Someone got a name wrong, someone got an identifier wrong, and therefore the payment failed. Now, we can't stop that happening, obviously, but what we can do is make sure that that happens before anybody is asked to commit funds. And that's what agreement of terms is about. We also ask, why doesn't everyone do this? It's a simple thing to do. And it gets rid of so many of the problems associated with payments, so many expensive reconciliations and dispute management schemes and things like that. It just seems like a no-brainer to us. I used to work for M-Pesa. Well, not for M-Pesa. I used to work on M-Pesa. And M-Pesa introduced name recognition. So when you tried to send to a mobile ID, you would get a thing back saying, did you really intend to pay Mike Richards? After we instituted that, we closed 2 call centers because there was no longer a need for people managing the reversal of payments that had been sent by mistake to the wrong number. And that's something simple like a phone number, which you kind of expect people to know. When you think about more complicated things, I'm not going to say GLEIF, you can see that the chances for error become much greater. And as I say, we can't stop errors happening, but what we want to do is to stop them causing a problem. The second thing that I want to talk about is tiered KYC. This is a fundamental part of the level 1 principles. And it means it allows customers to join with varying levels of know your customer information. And depending on the level of KYC provided, customer accounts are restricted, perhaps by maximum payment size or number of payments per day or maximum account balance. Why do we do this? Well, it is an inclusive system. And what we want to do is to make sure that we include people as much as we can, subject, of course, to being safe about it. This is a regulatory requirement. It allows our regulators in various countries, particularly in relation to mobile money systems, allow customers to join these systems with various levels of KYC information. And customers who join low KYC can only do restricted amounts of stuff. But it means they can join and form part of the financial infrastructure in that country. We want a minimum standard entry, not a maximum standard. And that also means that entities can transact with each other in an IIPS without knowing what kind of entity they're dealing with. It means the sender doesn't need to know in advance whether or not they can send the payment, because the receiver will either say, no, I can't, or yes, I can. So that means, and this is why I was interested yesterday, to understand whether a payment can be made, that is to agree terms, the beneficiary's DFSP must check at the time the payment is agreed what the beneficiary's KYC status is and whether or not the payment can be made based on the current state of the account. Now, this is not something that the switch can know. It's not something that the sender can know. It's something that only the recipient, the creditor institution, can know. And it needs to know it at the time the payment is requested. Now, fortunately, agreement of terms means that we can understand whether the payment will succeed or not, provided that the creditor DFSP accurately reports the state of the account. If it doesn't, then we're in trouble. And the reason we're in trouble is because of promises. Because what a Mojaloop system says, pardon me, confirming the agreement of terms means is, I will execute the payment on these terms if I possibly can. You may send me this money and be confident that it will be credited to the beneficiary. Now, if that's an empty promise because the DFSP hasn't looked to see whether the account can receive those funds or not, then you're going to wind up with failed payments. And then you're going to wind up with increased costs. So where those two things aren't true, where you don't have agreement of terms or accurate status of creditor accounts, then you expect to see that reflected in increased remediation costs and therefore in increased operating costs for the system as a whole. Our conclusion is it should be possible to guarantee that once the DFSP requests execution of the payment will complete and it will not require remediation. A debtor DFSP needs a method which can use to verify that that's happened, because in a well-run system, our view is that funds aren't deducted from the sender's account until execution has been verified, until the sending institution is confident that the receiver really has got the funds. And a creditor DFSP needs to receive a request for payment which it's agreed to. And all the parties need to be confident that they're acting on reliable information. Now, Mojaloop is a system which allows that, but it doesn't enforce it. It's possible to implement a Mojaloop system, as we saw yesterday, in ways that don't include some or all of these, which may not be a problem. But when we talk about connecting these systems to each other, and one system is expecting, for instance, a full agreement of terms to be executed, then what's going to happen? The receiving scheme will expect that terms have been agreed, but actually they haven't. So the receiving scheme will have to remediate in cases where payments fail. We need to look at, we could ask proxies to stand in for schemes that work in different ways, provided their differences of method and not of function, provided it does the same thing in different ways. But if it's a functional difference, then the point we need to bear in mind is that the costs of differences in function will be borne by the lower cost scheme, not the higher cost scheme, which may be a problem. Okay, I haven't got much time left. Simeon, I note, has assumed his hangman pose. So I'm going to talk briefly about compliance for cross-border payments. We're complying with something called FATF, the Financial Action Task Force Recommendation 16. It's a definition of it there. I'm not going to read it all out because I don't have much time left, so I'm just going to pass straight on. Basically, it's a good thing. It says people shouldn't be allowed to send money around the globe to perform nefarious actions of all kinds. In practice, though, it says payment execution requests must include information about the payer and the beneficiary. And it says this information must be retained in the message across its transmission chain, and the debtor's account holding institution is responsible for ensuring that this information is in the instruction. The beneficiary's account holding institution must verify the identity of the beneficiary, and the intermediaries are responsible for ensuring that the information is present, but not for evaluating it. Now, the problems here are, it's focused on jurisdictional requirements. It's all about national regulations. And the solutions where jurisdictions whose requirements differ, FATF recommendations for 16 has nothing to say on that subject, which is unfortunate because that's what we want it for. It contains an exception for small payments, which it defines as payments under $1,000. But two things about that. That exception is ambiguous. It says it might be a good idea, but it's, if you decide to exclude payments under that amount, or indeed under any amount, other jurisdictions are under no obligation to accept that. It contains a recommendation for the content that should accompany a payment instruction, but again, there are alternatives, and it's not clear how those are to be evaluated. So if one jurisdiction says you put the date of birth, and another jurisdiction says, no, you must have the address, again, it's not clear how those payment things would be evaluated. Intermediaries only have responsibilities, as I've said, in relation to the transmission of the content, but that's universally interpreted as a responsibility for evaluation, which is a major problem where messages pass through a number of institutions, possibly in different jurisdictions, and they all try to evaluate whether or not the payment is a terrorist payment. And the requirements in the end may conflict with privacy regulations about the transmission and storage of personal identifying information. And that's particularly a worry for us because, as you know, we want to be able to include in our schemes organizations that may be, let's say, somewhat more informal than international banks. And then there are also regulations about data sovereignty requirements. And again, where messages are being transmitted between jurisdictions, there may be problems with sorting out data sovereignty requirements. So what do we think? Oh, under a minute. Hold on. First of all, Mojaloop payments do not contain information about accounts. This is an important thing for FATF Recommendation 16. As you saw in the previous presentation, we work from identifiers. We present an identifier to a DFSP and say, do you know how to credit funds to the correct account based on this identifier? Phone number, GLEIF, whatever it might be. And if the DFSP says, yes, I do, we don't say, oh yeah, and what is that account number, pray? We say, okay, that's a business for you, not a business for us. So that payments contain information about the entities who hold accounts. And a unique payment identifier should therefore be sufficient to comply with Recommendation 16, which says, if a payment is not made to an account, then you only need a unique identifier, not an account number. So we're fortunate in that Mojaloop payments always have unique identifiers, so we don't have anything to worry about there. Currency conversion, in our view, is a request between financial institutions, not a request for transfer between accounts. What the financial institution is doing is asking for cover for the payment because it can't make the payment in the currency it needs. So we think that we don't need to include foreign exchange providers in the messages that are covered by Recommendation 16. And in any case, each currency conversion contains a reference to the underlying payment's unique identifier. So that can always be recovered. And finally, there's a suggestion in the in the FATF recommendations that we can require a customer identifying number as a reference to the underlying customer account. And as long as the institution can provide that information, that's all that needs to happen. I'm going to stop there because I've run out of time. Simeon, do we have time for any questions? Okay. Sorry, we don't have time for any questions, but I want to reiterate what I said at the beginning. This is the beginning of a journey to understand how we are going to fit schemes together, Mojaloop schemes, non-Mojaloop schemes. We need the support of the community in order to do that in the best way possible. So if you have any interest in these matters, please get in touch with me and I will arrange a group where we can discuss these things and wind up with, as I say, rules that we can give to other people to let them understand how to connect schemes together. Thank you very much.